congratulations on producing this wonderful book, which I know from talking to you over the last couple of years, as we've both been writing away. You won the race. You beat me. And it's, I would urge all of you to buy the book. It's very readable. It's a very convincing and thorough account, I think, of Russia's resurgence into international politics. And I think the title also indicates that that Russia is not as isolated necessarily as we might think, just because relations with the West have become so bad. So I'm going to start by asking a few questions of my own, and then in about 35 minutes or so, I get to ask you other people's questions too. But the book opens with this really interesting vignette about, of course, the very successful World Cup that was held in Russia in 2018. And it's a triumph, you say, of what you call Putin's plan. Russia is successful on a global stage, seemingly. It appears, just as it did in the Olympics in 2014, as a modern, normal country. And you note that some of the visitors who came to Russia for the World Cup were surprised that Russians are actually friendly, quite nice. And not everybody supports the regime, but many do. This is interesting because 2018, of course, is a time when relations with the West are perhaps the most fraught they have ever been since the end of the Cold War. I feel like I keep saying that every year, but now it's the worst. Now it's the worst. But this is, of course, in the wake of alleged evidence of interference in the U.S. elections in 2016 and the ongoing Mueller report. So we're particularly lucky, I think, to hear from you this evening on the eve of its deliverance, perhaps. The post-2014 annexation by Russia of Crimea, the sanctions that followed. So given the promise of the collapse of the Soviet Union for Russia and the attempts at democratization and marketization that took place under Boris Yeltsin, cooperation over arms control before that with Mikhail Gorbachev, and cooperation even with Putin's protege in the 4 years that Putin stepped sideways into the prime ministership and out of the presidency. How did we get to this level of confrontation with the West?
Well, thank you for the question, and I'm delighted to be here. I was here last time when my last book came out, so it's a pleasure to be back here. And that was on U.S.-Russian relations, and then we thought things were bad, but it's much worse now. The narrative, I think, that Putin has really favored and that most Russians now believe is that the 1990s, which we look upon as one where there was cooperation, or we look upon the Gorbachev era where we worked together with Gorbachev quite successfully, that narrative now is that in the 1990s, Russia was humiliated. The United States and its allies created a system, a security system in which Russia really had no agency. The state was weak. It was sort of falling apart. And Putin, of course, as you know, his background was as a mid-level KGB officer in East Germany. And when he was chosen by the people around Boris Yeltsin, who was at that point ailing, to be the next president, he came to office in mind with two things: to restore a strong state, because he believed Russia had to have a strong state, and to restore Russia's, what he thought, rightful role as a global power, as a major player on the world stage. And I think even though at the beginning of Putin's tenure in office, there were indications that he wanted to work with the West, he was supportive, of course, of the United States, of the Bush administration after the 9/11 attacks, and we did work with the Russians in the first phase of the war in Afghanistan. I think after that, there was a mismatch between the expectations that Russia had of what a better relationship with the West would look like and what our expectations were. And one of our Russian colleagues, whom I do quote in the book, described what Putin wanted after 2001 as an equal partnership of unequals. He understood that Russia was economically, militarily weaker than the West, the United States, but he believed that Russia had the right to be treated as an equal. It was still a nuclear superpower. And then we can go through the litany of things that happened, starting with the Iraq War and the color revolutions and the litany of complaints about that. And so I think we're now at the stage where Russia, or Putin's Russia, has really kind of dug its heels in and said, we're not going to accept this anymore. And Russia has been able, under Putin, quite cleverly to restore its role, both regionally and in parts of the globe from which the Soviet Union retreated after the Soviet collapse. And of course, by now, and you've mentioned the other factors that have caused the relationship to deteriorate so much, it's obviously annexation of Crimea, the launch of a war in southeastern Ukraine, and the refusal of the Russians to admit that they're involved in the war, mostly. And then the granting of political asylum to Edward Snowden. We can go through the litany of things, and then finally, obviously, the interference in the 2016 elections. So. But I think things started to go wrong. I would say the point was after the end of 2001, when Putin's expectations were not fulfilled and he felt betrayed, I think, having supported the United States and not having gotten what he considered Russia deserved in return.
Right. And that's you make that also make that argument in your previous book, which is more narrowly on U.S.-Russian relations, the troubled partnership. So in this book, though, you talk. It is aptly titled "Putin's World,"
right?
And Forbes magazine has rather hyperbolically called him the most powerful man in the world. I'm not sure that's true, but how does Putin see the world? What is Putin's world? And you use this term that I was mentioning to you earlier that I also heard at a conference at Yale last week with some historians, Russian exceptionalism. So is that his view, and how widely shared do you think that view is?
So in the book, I do have historical discussions of, the view I think that Putin puts forward of the Russian view of the world isn't something that began, 5-10 years ago. It's a centuries old. The idea of Russian exceptionalism goes back a number of centuries. And that is the idea that Russia has a unique civilization. Now, of course, the United States has a history of believing in its own exceptionalism. So we can't say Russia's the only country that believes it. But this is that it has a unique civilization, and that civilization is distinct from that of the West and really can never work that well with the West. And I quote the Slavophile poet Fyodor Turchev saying, "The Western Russia will always be antagonistic. The Western Russia can never be partners." And this is the idea then of Russia as a unique Eurasian civilization. And then Putin has also added to that now a much more contemporary spin, which is that Russia is the leader of what he calls a conservative international, that the West is decadent. You've even seen with the Russian response on social media to the burning of the Notre Dame Cathedral that this is somehow the revenge by God, on the satanic West, that the West doesn't practice Christianity as it should, that Russia is the harbinger of true Christianity and true traditional values, and that the West is decadent. And then the other side of that is Putin puts himself forward. This is, again, a much more pragmatic part of this, if you like, exceptionalism, that Russia will support all leaders who are duly in power, whether they're authoritarian, whether they're democratic, whether they were fairly elected or not. So, we are the exceptional power and we support the status quo, and the West is the agent of chaos. So it's a mixture of, I would say, ideas that are several centuries old and some much more modern ones.
And that's is there a trajectory to his thinking? Is there a development, do you think, of an ideology behind this? And is it just Putin who has this, or is this something that's relatively widely shared?
Yeah. So I wouldn't call it an ideology as Marxism-Leninism was. And I think a lot of what Putin puts forward is really supposed to apply to the Russian-speaking world. He doesn't believe that the rest of the world is necessarily going to agree with this philosophy. I think a large majority of Russians do somehow believe in the idea that they are different, they are maybe exceptional, and that the West is not their natural partner. I think that's quite widely spread. I think, we tend to exaggerate maybe the extent to which the liberal intelligentsia, how large it is and what it believes. And we saw with the annexation of Crimea, how many people, I'm sure you had that experience too, whom you had thought wouldn't support it, were actually very enthusiastic about it.
Right, including Mikhail Gorbachev, actually. Yeah, это наше, right? It's ours. So relatively widely shared, I guess, is what you say, or at least aspects of it. So would you say, though, well, let me ask you this. Can you link it to his foreign policy decisions or more recent foreign policy decisions? That is, does he have sort of a strategy that comes from this? or is he just opportunistic in terms of grabbing things that he
So
can get?
I don't see Putin as a grand strategist. I see him as a tactician. And I think when you ask the question, how did a country like Russia, which today has a per capita GDP less than that of Italy, its total GDP is about the size of the state of Texas, right? It's got a declining population and crumbling infrastructure. How did it manage to reassert itself? And I think that's because Putin has been very adept at taking advantage of opportunities, given to him by the West's indecision, by its prevarication. If you talk about Syria, which we may later, there was a red line, then there wasn't a red line. So he's really adept at doing that. And he's been in power for 18 years, 19 years now, and he's seen a lot of leaders come and go. And so he's good at that. He's a good tactician. I don't really see a grand strategy behind it. I think an essential part of it is believing that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and that no Euro-Atlantic structures, i.e. NATO, the European Union, should move any closer to Russia. I think that's a pretty deeply held belief, and I think that's shared by a lot of Russians too.
So would a different leader behave differently in his or her being
Yeah, we can
charitable
always
there?
say her, right?
Yeah, right. There are not a lot of women leaders in Russia right now, but in his foreign policy, we did see Medvedev behave differently between 2008 and 2012. So Russia certainly has interests that probably translate from leader to leader, but.
I think it was probably inevitable that after the chaos of the 90s, that the next Russian leader would have wanted to restore, Russia's role more and would have wanted to restore a more robust foreign policy. I think it would have been unlikely that you would have had sort of the Yeltsin system such as it was continuing. But as you say, with Medvedev, you had a younger leader, and he, who was much more forward-looking and got on well with President Obama and many of the European leaders. But the problem was, one of the reasons Putin decided to come back to power was because he objected to what Medvedev had done in terms of what was happening in Libya. And so I think that, and then of course there are people who will say, well, there are other leaders who would be much more aggressive than Putin, and I think that's true too. So I think a different leader might have a less adversarial kind of view of the West. After all, again, Putin and the people around him do mainly come from the security services. But I think the idea, it would be unlikely to have a leader that didn't believe that Russia had the right to be and should be a great power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I think you note in the book, and I also run across this, that a pretty great majority of Russians in public opinion polling, 65% perhaps, when you ask the question, is Russia a great power, whatever that means exactly, will say yes, it is. Yeah. So they have some measure in their head.
And let me just mention the latest opinion poll from Levada shows that 70% of Russians view Joseph Stalin favorably
I read
today, which is really something. Yeah.
One of the reasons I asked specifically about Putin relative to other leaders is the book's not called Russia's World. Right. It's really specifically called Putin's World. So clearly you see some difference between Putin, Yeltsin, Gorbachev, perhaps Medvedev as well. Is that particularly because of the security experience, or does he have a particular view of the world, do you think, that is somehow distinct? I'm trying to push you a little further.
Well, I called it Putin's world because I was trying to explain why relations between Russia and the West are so bad, and yet the rest of the world, there are many other countries in the world that regard Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom they can do business and whose interests are legitimate. And so I think it's important for us in the West to understand that we have that's the rest, right? And it's Putin's world because he's been the leader for 19 years, and it's under his, stewardship. And, even when Medvedev was president, we know that he wasn't calling the shots all the time. And it's, since Putin's been in the Kremlin, that Russia has restored its role. It's playing a much more disruptive role internationally than it was, in the 1990s, and that's why,
and perhaps in the 80s,
and the 80s too. Exactly, yeah. The Gorbachev era looks like a golden era now, and that's why I called it Putin's world because it is under his leadership, and as far as we understand, he's still, even though he's not the most powerful man in the world, he's certainly the most powerful man in Russia. He's not all powerful, but he really makes a number of the most important foreign policy decisions would not be made without him.
Right. Okay. So before we get to the West, because I think we probably know a little, before I get to U.S.-Russia relations, at least, I want to talk about the rest, and some of the rest are in the West. It's a lot of rhyming. And in particular, Germany. One of the things I was telling you earlier I particularly enjoy is the pictures that you have in the middle of the book of Putin in various settings. And there is an iconic shot that people may not be familiar with this incident, but an iconic shot of an incident between Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and Putin's dog Coney. So can you tell us about that? And you can and talk about the relationship with Germany and how that's evolved.
Sure. So, Germany has been Russia's most important European partner historically, and now obviously in the modern era, in the post-Soviet era too. I would call Merkel and Putin the odd couple. She is the daughter of a West German pastor, but who moved to East Germany, and she grew up in the GDR. She understood what that system was like, and yet she won the prize when she was in high school for the person who could speak Russian best and who loved Russian culture. And so she was given, a free trip to the Soviet Union. He, of course, is a former KGB agent who spent 5 years in East Germany, and as far as we know, liked it there, and then had to leave in a very humiliating way when the Berlin Wall came down.
His German's pretty good.
His German's good. Yeah, his German's good, and they speak each other's language. They don't need interpreters when they speak.
I wonder if she speaks Russian while he speaks German when they're alone.
Well, my understanding is that they can certainly be together without interpreters and speak each other's languages. So, in one of her first encounters with President Putin, like a good KGB agent, obviously he'd read her file and he understood that she had been bitten by a dog when she was a child, and she was afraid of dogs. And Putin, as we know, is a great dog lover. He has had a lot of different dogs and has them today. And he had this big black Labrador. And so in one of the early times when they met, she's sitting alone in a room in Sochi, and suddenly the dog bounds into the room, and obviously she's a professional politician and is in control of herself, but she has this grim look on her face, and the picture has Putin sitting next to her and smirking. But then we fast forward. So
the dog didn't get out by accident.
Right? No. The dog did not get out by accident. But she was very carefully constructing what she hoped would be the most productive relationship with Russia that was possible, even though she understands who Putin is and where he comes from. The economic relationship's very important, but trying to build a better political relationship. And then really the annexation of Crimea was also a great shock to her because she invested so much in a kind of peaceful post-Cold War order where everyone respected the borders of other states. And she was the one who had many conversations with him and reportedly said to President Obama at the time that Putin, quote unquote, lived in another world. Anyway, the relationship deteriorated. I quote one of our colleagues who said Ostpolitik became Frostpolitik, so the better relationship with Russia really deteriorated, and Germany was the leader and has been in imposing sanctions. But, and let me come to the second picture of the two of them in the book, one of the things that's begun to change this, even though Germany is still, insisting on having these post-Crimea sanctions, is the Trump effect. Yeah. So the very fact that we now have an American president who has criticized her to her face about a number of things, who questions the need for NATO, who says that the Germans are free riders, who doesn't seem to understand that the Volkswagen plants in the United States and all of the actually employ Americans. Anyway, all of that has also, not that it's changed her view of Russia, but it's made the German political class rethink, where do they go going forward. And so the other picture I have the dog, and then the other is last summer after a particularly difficult meeting, NATO meeting, where, it was caught on camera, President Trump criticizing her. Putin is coming up with a big bunch of pink roses and smiling as he gives them to her. So again, she's not naive, but it just shows you that a country like Germany has been forced to some extent to even reevaluate now the relationship with Russia.
Right. And there is some dependency of Germany on Russia, of course, for natural gas in particular. So again, another since we're on the subject of photos, I guess I'll move into another one that I thought was excellent. And I mentioned to you earlier that I had just been in China for 10 days. You have this great one of President Xi of China, who's basically declared himself now president for life. I guess I should take the word basically out. Possible role model for Putin there. Making blinis, Russian pancakes, with President Putin. What about China? Are these two amigos bound to? Are they
bromance, right?
Equal partners here? Because I thought she was dating Trump, but there's
There's such a thing as double dating,
right? Exactly, he's right. Playing the field.
So the Russian-Chinese relationship has gotten quite a lot closer, in my opinion, since 2014, since the events in Ukraine, because the West, the U.S., the Europeans were trying to isolate Russia, imposing sanctions, and the Chinese, even though I think they don't really approve of the annexation of Crimea, they have their own problems with, territorial questions and things like that, but they basically backed Russia up. After the sanctions were imposed, they signed a major natural gas deal with Russia on terms that the Russians wouldn't have signed a year before, but they were forced to sign it. They didn't have any choice in terms of the price for
not the best terms for
not
Russia.
The best terms, but they got the deal, and the Chinese really have backed them up. So there's a big debate in this country about is this just a very asymmetrical instrumental partnership that doesn't mean much, or is it something more? And I think even though the Russians are clearly the junior partner, I've had Russians say to me, and you may have heard something different when you were in China, we know that we are, but we accept it because, what's the alternative? And so they were making these pancakes around the same time that Chinese troops for the first time participated in Russian military maneuvers in the Russian Far East, even if that isn't that significant. I mean, the symbolism of that is rather important. Both Russia and China talk about the need for a post-West order. We can argue how they see it, but they both feel that they have been hard done by, that their interests were neglected in the post-Soviet era, if you like, in the post-Cold War era, again, by the United States constructing a system in which they've had no agency. And, of course, they support each other domestically, right? The Russians are never going to criticize the Chinese for their treatment of the Uyghurs and other minorities. And of course, the Chinese aren't going to criticize the Russians for what they do domestically. So, so far it works well. Now, in the longer run, there may be more tensions between the two countries. China is a rising power. Russia is not a rising power. And in their shared neighborhood, they may be more competitive with China's Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia. But still, I think we are at a different point now in the Chinese-Russian relationship than we were even 5 years ago.
Yeah, so it is notable that China has not really invested very much in Russia with Belt and Road. There have been a lot of proposals from Russia for China to invest, but China's chosen not to, so pretty sort of strategic partner.
Right, and I went to a Russian-Chinese conference in Moscow a couple of years ago where the Chinese had wonderful PowerPoint presentation about the Belt and Road being a win-win for everybody. And one of my Russian colleagues said to me afterwards, when the Chinese talk about win-win, they mean I win twice.
Right? I win, right. Yeah, I think that's probably accurate. So let's talk a little bit, too, about the Middle East, because Russia, especially under Putin, has accomplished some amazing things by being friends with everyone. Right. Another couple sets of nice pictures of Bibi Netanyahu and Putin, and some people think that Russia's tech industry is basically located in Tel Aviv. But also friends with Iran, trading with Iran, active with Iran, in Syria, change the facts of the ground in Syria. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of those things in Saudi Arabia as well?
So unlike in the Soviet period when the Soviet Union chose sides in the Middle East, right, ideological sides, you had to be socialist or pretend you were socialist.
Yeah, it's an interesting change.
It's a very interesting change. It's a completely pragmatic Russian policy in the Middle East. I quote a senior Israeli official who said to me, Russian policy in the Middle East is aggressive, flexible, and cognizant of its limits. And I think that's true. So the Russians, as you mentioned, are the only major power that talk to all sides in all disputes in the Middle East, and they're seen as an arbiter, a neutral arbiter. So they have, pretty close ties with Iran, not without tensions, and with Shia groups, all of the major Sunni states, and then with Israel. And this is, again, unprecedented. It was never like that, whereas the United States has chosen sides in the Middle East, as we know. And so Russia looks differently. And its two new kind of closer partners are both Saudi Arabia and Israel, partly for the same reason. Kremlin. They both hope that Russia can temper Iranian ambitions in that region, which I'm not sure that the Russians can, but that's what they believe. The relationship with Saudi Arabia is obviously largely driven by the oil price question, and now you have Russia cooperating with the OPEC countries to keep production down so that prices stay high. And then, of course, with Israel, it's about a number of things. It's about the Syrian civil war. It's about the high-tech industry and about the 1.3 million Israelis who come from the former Soviet Union. So this is something new. Russia can't replace the United States in the Middle East in as much as it doesn't have the military or economic wherewithal to do that. But it is a presence there, and clearly it's a major arbiter, will be once the Syrian civil war is over. And as you said, I mean, Putin has managed to bring the Iranians and Turks together, to talk about peace there. No other country's done that.
Right, and by our insistence, presumably, of having Assad leave, we are out of the conversation at this point because that's not going to happen.
And I mean, the Russians went in 2015 and started a bombing campaign which enabled Assad to stay in power.
Right, and moved very quickly, surprisingly quickly, I think. Even our own military would show that, would attest to that. So there's a lot in the book, too, on Russia's relations with the former Soviet states. The one that I should focus on in our conversation here is really Ukraine, and what the exit strategy is for Russia in Ukraine, if there is one. And of course, Ukraine is now moving toward the second round of its presidential election. There are rumors, revelations that perhaps the leader in those elections, who is not the current president, is backed by the Kremlin. So what's up with Ukraine, Angela? Is there an exit from this? What is the goal or end game? Did Putin make a mistake, or is this a terrific win for him?
So let me first of all say, isn't it unprecedented to have someone with no political experience who had his own TV show about to become president of a country?
But he was a comedian.
But he was a comedian.
He was a comedian.
Right, and he has a TV show, which I don't know if I have not seen it, but I really should.
He plays the president of the United States. He's the accidental president.
Right, he's an accidental president. So there's a lot we don't know about him. He's called Volodymyr Zelensky, but I think he's going to win on Sunday. I mean, the polls show that he's going to win. Is he backed by Russia? What would he do? This isn't clear. What's the Russian exit strategy?
I'm quoting Ukrainian Twitter on that, by the way.
Right. So, the Russians are insisting that a prerequisite for them withdrawing their support for the separatists is the Ukrainian parliament passing a law which gives a special status to the area that's now where the war is, the Donbas region. And that special status would essentially give that region a veto power over foreign policy decisions made by the central government in Kiev, i.e., if NATO and EU membership were on offer for Ukraine, which they're not, and they may not be for a very long time, if ever, but if they were and the Ukrainian government decided that they wanted to join, then the Donbas would have the right to veto that. So this is a non-starter for the Ukrainians, and I think Zelensky himself has also said that special status is a non-starter. So, on the one hand, I have debates with, I'm sure you do with my colleagues about this. On the one hand, you can say the Russian campaign in Ukraine has been successful in as much as it's made it much more difficult for the government in Kiev to function. It has a war going on. The economy is struggling. On the other hand, you can also say that this war has really united Ukrainians in a way that they weren't united before in terms of their national identity and their views of Russia. And that, of course, has been counterproductive. So, it depends which, what your point of view is when you look at this. I'm not sure what the exit strategy is. Maybe having United Nations peacekeeping troops there is a beginning, but even there's no agreement at the moment on where that contact line, where they could go, where they could deploy these troops. And the Russians have a very different view of this than the Ukrainians. So I think there will be a push. I mean, Zelensky has said if he comes to power, when he's elected, there'll be a push to restart what we call the Normandy format, which is France, Germany, and Ukraine and Russia, and because it's been dormant for 2 years. But it's unclear to me what will have changed, unless you really do have a leader in Kiev that is willing to make more compromises. I mean, obviously, one of the compromises that some people talk about would be to recognize that Crimea is part of Russia, and in return the Russians withdraw. But I don't see that happening either.
Right, and the actor that you're not mentioning is the West, writ large, led by the United States.
Right.
There's not a ton of U.S. leadership in this area.
No.
So that brings me to my sort of last two questions before we start taking some questions from the audience. What mistakes have been made by the West? We've talked only really about what successes Putin has scored, but you mentioned in the book some flawed assumptions. What were those?
Well, I think in the beginning, even those for people who knew about Russian history and Russian traditions, I think it was a mistake to believe when the Soviet Union collapsed that post-Soviet Russia would necessarily want to become like the West and would want to be integrated into Western institutions. I mean, a small group of people around Boris Yeltsin did want that. But I think we underestimated the degree of resentment that would come from the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. And the fact that, significant numbers of Russians today and even earlier on really don't believe that the Soviet Union collapsed because of its own mistakes, but because of the agency, of the United States and its so-called, special services. So I think that was a mistake.
Overestimates our special services.
Right. Of course they overestimate. They think our special services are all powerful.
But that is Putin's view.
Yeah. Oh, no. I think so. But I think that overestimates it. So I think that was maybe a flawed assumption. Then I think, you can go into a long debate about the fact that the West was unable to create a Euro-Atlantic security system in which Russia had a stake. So it's the NATO enlargement question. I don't think that was a mistake. There are obviously people who think that it was, but it is a fact that we weren't able to create such a system. Maybe we couldn't have, but maybe we didn't try hard enough.
And the bulk of that, though, ended in the mid-'90s, right? So why get so upset about it in 2014 is the big question in my mind.
Well, but because I mean, this was this has been revived as an argument for explaining or justifying why Russia did what it did in Ukraine. I think probably you can also question whether the shock therapy, economic therapy in the early 90s was the correct thing to do. Obviously, again, the small group of people around Yeltsin said that it was, but there are others who have a different view. And then they say if Russians wouldn't have suffered so much economically in the 90s, then they might have had a more benign view of what the West was trying to do.
And so is it then inevitable that the U.S. and Russia will be adversaries? I mean, it sounds like under Putin it probably is inevitable, although there was a time when they weren't, as you said back at the beginning of the talk.
Back at the beginning they weren't. So, if you look back at the history, if you go back to 1933 when the United States and the Soviet Union recognized each other, you go back and look at that whole period. I mean, the periods of real cooperation have been not that long. Obviously, you have World War II, you have the post-9/11 period, you have other periods when we've worked better with the Russians. So I think you have to admit that, in general, the best we can hope for is a relationship where we cooperate in some areas, but we compete in others. And we're now, the competition, global competition is back. I think if probably as long as Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin, it's going to be difficult because he seems to have such resentment against the West, although he just said earlier on this week we should improve ties with the West. So, he could change too, but the trajectory doesn't look that good. Under another leader, and I mean, it would also depend on who's in power in the United States, for instance, there are areas where we should be cooperating and we're not, and some of those things need to be restored. I mean, the whole arms control area, this is very serious. We now face the prospect that after 2021, if the Trump administration isn't interested in renewing the agreement that we have with Russia, the New START treaty on strategic arms, we'll have nothing that regulates the nuclear arsenals of the two countries that between them possess 93% of the world's nuclear weapons. So there's some areas where we haven't to work with the Russians and should, but there are other areas where it's probably going to be very difficult to agree with them. So, it would be in our interest to have conversations with the Russians and understand that we have to engage on some areas where we have common interests, but not try to engage or cooperate on areas where we don't. And we haven't been very good at doing that.
Okay, thanks. So I am now going to ask you a few questions that have been mysteriously and magically delivered to me here at the front. And the first one is, what does Putin hope to gain from his cyber war against the West?
So I think what he...
And first, is there a cyber war against the West? Is the premise, right?
Well, there's certainly cyber interference. I don't know if war is that we can argue about wars, but we certainly know that there's been cyber interference, in the United States, in Europe, there's certainly Ukraine. But let's talk about the West. What does he hope to gain from it? One of the things that I think Putin has very much resented has been what the United States and some of the European governments have done, criticizing Russia, that it's not democratic, that it's authoritarian. So one of the points he likes to make is, you think you're so much better than we are. And yet with the cyber interference, we know, plus the social, we're talking about cyber, but then there's also social media interference. If we put those two things together, the result of that, both in this country and in Europe, has been, to pit different groups against each other, to benefit and manipulate the polarization that Russia didn't create but exists. And so it's to get people to question the legitimacy of their own system, to feel uncertain about, can we trust our election machines? We're now in a position where, because of all this, people are going to question, whatever happens in the, what happened in the midterms, what happens in the next election. Is this a real result, or is this, was there manipulation, not only by Russia but China? So I think it's sort of exacerbating a discord that already exists, getting people to question, their own system. And I think that is something that has been, that he has gained from that. Right. Now, how much good that actually does Russia is another question. You could certainly say that there was, as a result of Russia's interference in our 2016 election, President Donald Trump, who wanted to have this much better policy with Russia, hasn't been able to do it because of the knowledge of what the Russians did. So I think the Russians may have buyer's remorse there, but they're never going to admit that.
Weren't anticipating being caught, perhaps.
Right. Well, maybe.
So next question. Is Putin/Russia, so he's fused, he's Mr. Russia, likely to interfere in the Baltics or Finland in the way that he has in eastern Ukraine or Crimea? And again, just the reason I point out Putin/Russia, are they the same thing?
So at one of these, I go to these annual meetings, you've been to some of them, called the Valdai Discussion Club, and there we meet with, they invite foreign experts on Russia to come meet with President Putin and other senior officials. So at one of these meetings a few years ago...
I'm always struck by how short he is, actually. It's sort of interesting. Yeah.
At one of these meetings a few years ago, Mr. Volodin, who's now the Speaker of the Russian Parliament, actually said, Putin is Russia, Russia is Putin, and without Putin, there's no Russia. Okay, so I'm just quoting him. But then this was echoed by some people at least. Sorry, what was it?
So right. Are they likely to, are they, Putin, Russia, likely to interfere in the Baltics or Finland in the way they have in
they've
Ukraine.
already interfered in the Baltics in the cyber, through cyber means and other means.
In 2007 and occasionally still.
And occasionally then. Finland, the Finns are pretty tough. The Russians have tried some of this cyber stuff, but the Finns are pretty good at it. They're also a very high-tech country. Are they going to send little green men into the Baltic states? Probably not. I think what the Russians have succeeded in doing since the events in Ukraine, of course, is to get people to question how valid the NATO promises, the Article 5 that is coming to the defense of the Baltic states, were they invaded in a conventional way, to get them to question that. President Obama went after that. He went to the Baltic states. He said, yes, we believe in this commitment. But, if you look at some of the public opinion data in Germany, for instance, the majority of Germans say that they would not want to fight, want their sons and daughters to fight to defend a country, like the Baltic states, even though that they're in.
I think President Trump has said that, I'm not sure we'd do that.
Right, exactly. So there's already this questioning, and obviously the Baltic states, their response to that has been to build up their own defenses. And there are these NATO brigades now that are in the Baltic states. The Germans are in Lithuania, which is quite interesting given what happened in World War II. So we've shored up, to some extent, the NATO presence there. And I think ultimately the Russians understand that the Baltic states are in NATO, but of course they will, just as they've done election interference, they'll continue that kind of cyber and social media interference, again, to keep people off balance.
It'd be disruptive, basically. there are a lot of things they can do, presumably below the threshold of Article 5, right? That's a question.
Right. And
what
and
is
that's,
it exactly?
Right, and that's another issue. How do you define Article 5 and how do you define an attack? And it isn't only sending troops in.
Right.
In the cyber era, it's, it can be done in other ways.
Right. Oh, this is a great question. Is Venezuela going to be another Cuban Missile Crisis?
Ooh. So, I mean, we've certainly seen in the past couple of weeks the Russians upping the ante there. I mean, they went into Venezuela when Hugo Chavez was elected and when the relationship with the United States deteriorated. And they do have a stake in backing the Maduro government.
Grabbing an opportunity.
Right, grabbing an opportunity with Chavez right in the U.S.'s backyard. And from the Russian point of view, we're supporting Ukraine right in their backyard. Why shouldn't they be there? And so that, Venezuela owes Russia, I think, about $17 billion, and the Russians have a stake in the Venezuelan oil industry, and they've sent these regular troops, they're also mercenaries there, to train the Venezuelans and to make sure to shore up the military, because the reason why Maduro is still there is because the military supports him. We know that. But having said that, we do know, or Mr. Guaido has said that, he's been in conversation with the Russians, and that if he becomes president and Maduro leaves, they're not going to kick the Russians out. So I think to some extent the Russians are hedging their bets. I don't think this is going to be another Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, their presence in Venezuela is relatively cheap at the moment. But I think they're probably, again, it's an irritant, it's disruptive. And it's gotten the White House, pretty angry. But I think, I'm not sure it would escalate to that level.
Are we willing to, we're rattling a few sabers, the U.S. Are we really willing to go to war with Russia over Venezuela?
Well, obviously not.
Right, you would think not. So, but probably not another Cuban Missile Crisis where they put missiles in and we try to back.
No, I think that that era is past. Yeah.
So you don't think Putin's a risk taker, presumably, but not that much of a risk.
Not that much of a risk taker. He likes to take risks on the cheap, but not something that would be that costly.
Okay, this is another great question. Do you think there is a generational gap, Angela, between those that grew up with the Cold War and those that didn't, as far as understanding Putin or as a threat, or I would think supporting Putin? What risks does this offer? So that is,
but in which country?
Well, in Russia, is there I'm assuming that's what the question's asking. Right. Is there a younger generation that opposes Putin and is more liberal? And are there opportunities for, I assume, the United States or the West?
So interestingly enough, there was a series of articles, I guess a couple of years ago, about the Putin generation, and a lot of young people have never known anyone as president of Russia except for Putin, and there isn't a huge groundswell of opposition to him, I would say. So this is now 10 years ago. I taught a course at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations on U.S.-Russian relations, and these were well-educated, from the elite, traveled abroad, spoke English, and most of them, I mean, they're all so now they were maybe, let's say they're 20 then, so they're now in their 30s. But at that point, those were also people who didn't believe that the Soviet Union collapsed because of its own weaknesses, believed that the West was responsible for that, believed that Russia was a great power, and even if they didn't all support Putin personally, they supported the idea of a strong, successful Russia. So I don't see a huge groundswell of younger people who oppose Putin. Now, having said that, Alexei Navalny, who's the big anti-corruption politician in Russia, who, he can mobilize young people, high school kids, to come out and demonstrate. So that there are groups of young people who want something different. But I think, again, once you go outside the big cities, public opinion data isn't so clear on that.
Yeah, there aren't as, that's my impression too, just from looking at the data. And there aren't, Putin will lose elections across generations in Moscow, even in St. Petersburg.
Right, and in the city council election, right, the last ones in Moscow, a majority of people who are elected are anti-Putin.
Right.
But so that's unusual.
Right, but and so as you go east in the country, or south, he's much more likely to win. And that's where most people live.
And again, there really aren't too many alternatives, except for Alexei Navalny and his YouTube channel.
And he's technically not allowed to run for office himself.
He's been barred from doing
Right.
that. Yeah.
Okay, so here's another good question. Points to the size of Russia. Russia's the largest country on Earth geographically. Russia is so gigantic. Does it have control over its own territory? Are people from China still moving into Siberia?
Okay, so that's a very important aspect of the Russian-Chinese relationship,
Right.
which
Yep.
we didn't talk about. So it is the largest country in the world, and it's pretty inhospitable living in the Russian Far East. Very cold climate. And that part of, the population in Russia is declining anyway, but that part of Russia, the Russian Far East, is being very rapidly depopulated.
Right.
So there are about 6 million people that live in that, so the Primorsky Krai, that part of the Far Eastern Russia, and over the other side of the border,
Pacific coast.
right, the Pacific coast. On the other side of the border, I think there are 105 million Chinese, and there are a lot of Chinese migrant workers who are working in the Russian Far East. You pointed out that the Chinese aren't investing that much there. But certainly, from a small business point of view, they're there. And there's also Russian resentment. The Russians who live there don't want to even lease land to the Chinese. People tell me that if you go to certain parts of China and certain offices, you can find maps still where the Russian Far East is Chinese. When Mao Zedong was in power, he said all that land, in fact, belonged to China. So in the longer run, I wonder what's going to happen. And then the other thing one should mention is it's not only that the Russian population is declining, but in Russia, the male mortality rate for young men between 18 and 30 is very high. It's like that of a country in sub-Saharan Africa, not of a developed economy and country like Russia. And so you have a lot of, a sizable number of Russian young women who just don't have men to marry. And then, of course, in China, with the one-child policy, it may not be over now, but as a result of it, you have
too many men.
They have far too many men. And so one of the things that you begin to see happening in that part of the world is intermarriage.
Right.
Now, I don't know if that's a solution to it, but
Right.
it's a possible trend.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's still going to be a lot more Chinese men than Russian women.
Russian women, that's true. Yeah.
Okay, so a few Putin-U.S. related questions here. I'm going to try and group some of them. This first one, though, however, having given that wind-up, is not that. If for some reason Putin disappears from the stage, this is about the succession, who in the modern Russian political scene would you see as a potential leader?
So this is a very difficult question.
Who's the successor?
Deliberately, there is no obvious successor. Putin has appointed a number of younger men in their 40s to be provincial governors, and every so often you hear rumors, this one could be a potential successor, but they usually then leave or it's not clear. There are rumors, maybe the current mayor of Moscow could be a successor. The defense minister, although he's not an ethnic Russian, so...
But
would be more
he is
difficult.
allowed to score goals in Putin's hockey games. That's how he's one of the few.
One of the few.
Other than
Okay,
Putin.
so that's a very important
And
data
he does
point.
appear with Putin a lot.
He does it, and he's a popular. Shoigu's
Right, yeah.
he's a popular politician.
Right, from Siberia.
But there's no obvious successor. So, if something happened to Putin tomorrow, we have no idea whether there's a plan or not. Technically, Dmitry Medvedev, now prime minister again, would take over for 3 months and then there'd be an election. But there'd be a huge succession struggle.
So, can you tell us more why it wouldn't be Medvedev? I'm guessing it wouldn't be Medvedev, and I'm guessing you agree.
Right. Well, I agree with you. Medvedev, it's convenient for Putin to have him still as prime minister. He gets blamed for a lot of things when the economy doesn't function properly, and he doesn't challenge Putin. So why not keep him around? But
And he's very loyal.
And he's extremely loyal. But the last time he was president, he obviously was unable to build his own independent base, and that's even eroded more.
Right. Interesting. So this question is somewhat related, and it's to Putin's popularity and as well as his image abroad. So one of Putin's greatest powers seems to be his way to manipulate the media and news, both at home and abroad. Is this a threat for Russians themselves? So it's basically manipulating information.
Well,
I guess a threat to society.
Well, I mean, you can say it's a threat to society if you don't have alternative sources of news.
Right.
And right now, the Russians have just passed a law which is trying to cut most Russians off from the global internet.
And build their own.
And build their own internet.
And what's the justification for that?
They don't want extremism, exactly, because if you allow people to, be on the World Wide Web, they can read all kinds of things that promote extremism. They're trying to do what the Chinese have done. They've come to it later. And of course, younger and more adept Russians know how to get around those things anyway. But I think it is, if you don't have complete information about things, you only have partial sources, it can really distort your view of the world.
Right. And Russian television is very biased, I would say. Anyway, but there are some channels and networks, dare I say, in other countries, including this one, that are somewhat biased.
Yes, but the point is that we have competition.
Right.
You have Fox and CNN.
Right. We have choice. Yes. Right.
If you only watch one of them, then of course you only get certain forms of information.
Or BBC or Yes.
Exactly.
Right. But that is the right. But that's the big difference. There's no pluralism or a variety of opportunities to get information elsewhere except the internet.
Right. And then there's one independent radio station that we both know, the Echo of Moscow, and there is an online TV station, Rain TV, Dorsh TV, which is independent, but
and not very much watched anymore because they've been kicked out of their studio.
Right.
Okay, so that problems obviously. Yeah, we're just saying this incidentally. No one watches them because you can't. So another question here on Ukraine. What is the interest of the West in Ukraine? What outcome for Ukraine would be preferable for the U.S. and why? Do we have a preference?
Right. So, and this question comes up a lot. And there are people in this country who believe that, we should understand that Ukraine's right next door to Russia and Russia sees it as an existential question and we don't. So why are we there? I mean, the interest in Ukraine is obviously, we've always believed, at least to bolster the independence and sovereignty of the post-Soviet states. To help Ukraine, I guess, become a better functioning independent state that can make its own choices. But it's very difficult because obviously since, the Ukrainians periodically go out and they protest and they get a new government, and then the new government usually proves to be as corrupt, if not more so, than the previous one. And so, I mean, the interest of the West should be in a stable, less corrupt Ukraine that is truly independent. But I don't think all Americans or even policymakers are convinced of that.
And American foreign policy for a very long time has been guided implicitly and sometimes explicitly by the one near law we have in political science, which is democracies don't fight democracies.
Right.
And so having more democracies would be better for the United States in the abstract.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But presumably our interest stops at actually going to war with Russia.
Right, because when the Russians annexed Crimea, I mean, the Obama administration advised the Ukrainians there not to fight back because they were going to be overwhelmed anyway. And President Obama, and he was quite explicit about it in an interview that he gave to Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic when he said, this means more to Russia than to us, and we're not going to get militarily involved in it. And I don't see any other U.S. administration doing that either.
Right. Although the sanctions Obama put on are the most extensive sanctions that were ever put on Russia.
Until the sanctions in the Trump administration.
Right. Well, they added them. Yes, they added them. Right. And the big question presumably is, will the Europeans hold tight with those?
Right.
Over
and once
time.
Angela Merkel is no longer chancellor, which she won't be for long, I think it's a big question.
Right. And the Russians do have some money to throw at Europe and invest here and there. And
they certainly do.
Europe. Yeah. Okay, so another set of great questions. I should have asked this one earlier because it's about Russian domestic politics, really. And the person says, in the Gorbachev era, which was 1985 to 91, when he was the last general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the ABA, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, worked to bring. Oh, no. This is the ABA, the American Bar Association. Sorry.
Yeah,
I was going to say ABM or ABA, right. The American Bar Association worked to bring legal reform to Russia. Mm-hmm. Do reforms still exist on the street level? I'm not sure what street level means, but is there still legal reform going on? A Russian scholar has said yes, but that was several years ago.
So the interesting thing about the legal reform is in some areas, both business and sort of civil law, there have been legal reforms, and it's better than it used to be.
And
right?
the ABA was active in the Yeltsin
Right.
in the 90s.
And the ABA was active in the 90s. And I mean, they still, I think, interact with the Russians. What's changed or has gone back to looking more Soviet is in anything that has to do with politics, or I have to say now business, and that's the difference. It really doesn't apply. Now, we just have the case of Michael Calvi, who's, was the biggest U.S. investor in Russia, married to a Russian, lived there for a long time, and got into apparently a dispute with one of his Russian partners. And the Russian partner then went to the authorities and said, throw this man in jail. So he was in prison before any trial for what in this country would be, it's a business dispute, it's a civil case. You're not going to be thrown in jail until you've had a trial and it's been worked out. Now, he was released a couple of days ago.
House arrest.
Under house arrest, exactly. And my understanding is that's only because someone very powerful went to the president and said, release him from jail. So in anything that touches on politics or business interests, and you've seen that with the case with British Petroleum and everything, the law, the rule of law definitely doesn't apply, and the laws don't apply.
And Bill Browder.
And Bill Browder. So it just depends on the issue and how sensitive it is for the people around Putin.
Right. And so this is presumably going to depress investment, right? Because property rights are unstable.
Yeah. I mean, they've never been guaranteed.
Right. Okay. So the last question, I guess, before we can turn loose to the audience is, how is our review of Russia shaped by American domestic politics? We have one narrative for them. We have a very different one for Saudi Arabia, Israel, and other U.S. friends.
Well, right now, I think the view of Russia is toxic, right? So for anyone in this country who opposes President Trump, Trump and Russia are synonymous. And I think that's unusual. We have never quite had that before. I mean, there's no one view of Russia here, and there are obviously some people who have a very different view. But right now, it's often very difficult to have any rational discussion about Russia, depending on which side of the political fence you sit. And you obviously have different sources of opinion. I mean, last year I did a call-in show on cable TV, the Washington Journal, where I had people who were watching it calling me in from Kansas and parts of the Midwest and the U.S. state of Georgia and everything, and saying that they really love watching RT, which is a Russian propaganda TV show, and they don't believe things like, CNN, but they believe RT. So, it depends where you live or what your preconceptions are.
RT is Russia Today.
Right.
They
used to be Russia Today.
Right. That's what it stands for, but to make it a little more subtle.
Exactly.
Right. Yes. And you can get it in Dubai. You can get it all over the place if you turn on your TV. But Angela, thank you very, very much for a really lively discussion, and thank all of you.